Good evening, everyone. I would like to call to order the June 28, 2022 joint meeting of the Common Council at Winchester Public Schools. Carrie, would you please call the roll?
Councilor Bell.
Here.
Councilor Clark.
Here.
Councilor Hurtschit.
Here.
Councilor Hill.
Here.
Councilor Milstead.
Here.
Councilor Rodriguez. Here. Councilor Sullivan.
Here.
Councilor Beach.
Here.
And Mayor Smith.
Here. Thank you. Mrs. Emu?
Good evening. I know that's already been said, so I'm happy to be here, and I'm just really excited about all us coming together collectively and having this meeting. So I would like to welcome you again to our June 28, 2022 School Board / City Council joint meeting. Dr. Joyner, would you please call the roll?
Ms. Holman? Here. Mr. Birchnell?
Here.
Ms. Crawford? Dr. Pierce Gonzalez?
Here.
Ms. Truman?
Here.
Mr. Wallace?
Right.
Ms. Ema?
Here. Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is, we'll move on to the agenda. The first item on the agenda is a joint timeline for discussion of Winchester Public Schools budget.
So we're just now receiving this, so if you haven't had a chance to look over this for Winchester Public Schools Board, please take a few seconds and look over this, and then we can enter into some discussion.
So we had discussed aligning the timeline where the city starts the conversations with the department heads for the budget. And if you take a look at the timeline, the first initial meeting would be between the Winchester Public Schools and city staff in late January. And I will let the city manager, Dan Hoffman, speak on the timeline. Mr. Hoffman?
Thank you, Mayor. This was just a document to help guide any discussion that might be had between the two bodies. It really is a sample of our city budget timeline that we follow. I did include 2 rows that show where it might be a good point in that process to have a productive joint meeting early in the process. Obviously, there are ongoing discussions between myself and the superintendent during the process, and there's pretty open dialogue between our finance staff and the school's finance staff if any questions arise during our process. But this is really more to facilitate the discussion for school board members who might not be familiar with our process. It's not meant to lay out what is the process for Winchester Public Schools, but more to help give you a sense of the time frame by which we begin to formulate our budget, make decisions, and ultimately approve the budget.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Yes, please.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Hoffman. I did want to ask a question. I know that earlier in the year, the superintendent met with one of the council liaisons to kind of establish like a timeline in terms of just recommending them attend our 6 board meetings for budget, and then also recommended that they take some kind of notes so that they can come back and just kind of fill you guys in. Is that something that we still want to do, or will that replace the budget meeting, or we're like, what's your thought process in terms of doing what we said we were going to do in terms of using that liaison to attend those meetings and then kind of drawing a summary, reporting back to you guys? Are we going to do that in addition to the meeting?
I think that would be a good in addition component. The decisions that the city council makes along the way could be helpful or instructive to the school board to give a sense for where the council is headed with the budget. Obviously, it's in early March that we first start bringing budget scenarios at the committee level to council. Some of those early decisions would probably be instructive for the school board to get a sense for where we're going with possible tax increases, if any. What our budget projections in terms of revenue might look like. Obviously, it's early in the process. And many of those discussions Jason and I have already had, so that he has a good idea of what I might be thinking about proposing. I get a sense for what some of his priorities are. So I would say that the liaison plays a could play an important role in keeping the school board up to date with what those decisions are as we hit these milestones. So for example, at the this past year, it was in early March, the very first week of March actually, that the finance committee met. They first heard that $1 million number as a placeholder based on, we were basing on a 5% increase. And those were where some of those discussions first occurred, and where the finance committee at that point selected a scenario for us to continue to develop. So those types of things would be helpful, for the liaison to feed that information back to the school board so that you know where the city council's thinking is at that point in time.
Okay, thank you. And if I could just, one more comment, kind of a question. I'm looking at the timeline, and I understand that this is your timeline, but for late March, Winchester Public Schools budget presentation to council, and Mr. Miller and Jason can speak to that. One of the things that we have no control over is the governor's budget, and so when we present the budget, it is really important for us in terms of looking at it from a prudent perspective to really have real numbers. So I think we may have to have some wiggle room there, but I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that I see that here. So
yeah, and that's where it happens now. And I think this year it fell awkwardly based on when your meetings fell and when our meetings fell. So moving forward, it'll always wiggle a little bit, but obviously our meetings are Tuesdays at the second and fourth Tuesdays of the month. Yours are on Monday, so in a lot of cases there's going to be some awkward time adjustments to make sure that you're able to present information to us that's not, sometimes it might have been approved the day before.
sure.
So this will have to be something that we massage every year based on.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will now open this up for discussion and questions. Are there any questions? Councilman Sullivan.
Thank you, Mayor. So, sort of a question towards Dan and Jason as well. This past year was a little awkward because we didn't really have a state budget. But that being said, they pass a biannual budget. So I'm expecting that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it might be a little less stressful next year because it's a biannual budget. Is that safe to assume? Okay, so from a funding standpoint, I don't want to say what you're getting next year, but you have a better sense now than you did, for example, coming into this year. Okay, because some of this, we talk about calendars and timelines, and it does change every year, but that's also a big component, is that they do pass the biannual budget, and budget years are always what we just saw, quite frankly, down there. It's politicking 101 that they use to pass the budget, and it kind of just all falls on us to have to pick up the slack there. So something to keep in mind for everybody, that has an impact on how we have to do things. So hopefully this coming year it'll be a little smoother because of that.
Was that a question or comment?
That was both. He answered the question, which was yes, it'll be a little smoother because it's a biannual budget.
Okay.
And then a comment that,
Well, the only reason I asked that because I didn't hear an answer.
no, they were shaking their heads.
They were
yes.
shaking their
Yes.
heads. Yeah.
Okay, please speak into the microphone.
Yes.
Councilman Veach.
Thank you, Mayor. Dan, on the first item, the budget meeting between WPS and city staff, what staff is that on both sides?
So me and our staff speak frequently, throughout the year, but we thought maybe having just kind of a formal sit down between the two staffs early in the process, just to share information and talk about where we're heading with it. It might be good for my finance director, Jason's finance director, to make sure we're all on the same page, almost like a mini kickoff between our two, even though really a lot of the decisions at that point are going to be driven by what council and, of course, the school board are discussing. So that's really for staff to make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward.
And last, if I may, as you said, this is mostly our timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And the school has a lot of things going on their budget parallel to this. Could we hear from the school where theirs fills in on this?
Yeah, I do not profess to be an expert in school, but, yeah, it's just reporting.
This follows our process as well. We start our budget in November. We work with our departments to identify needs, and that bubbles up through our budget process. Between January and March, our school board has at least 3 additional meetings on top of our regularly scheduled meetings that are all public and available online to watch and review. You know, all of our items are listed by end of January. There's really not a lot of changes that happen between January and March from what is desired by, you know, department heads, et cetera. And then we go through a vetting process to narrow that to, as you know, our required items that we don't have a choice, from health insurance to, you know, when the state says you must hire another counselor, those are required items, to you know, things we would like to do, which fall into the salary categories, et cetera. So we tier those out, and we always bring forward our required bucket of items and our tier 1 bucket of items for our budget. So this timeline is the same. Any change to this, for example, if there was a desire to move up our presentation, that would change our process significantly. But if this is acceptable to council, this is what we already did.
When's your deadline to finalize your budget? When?
What's the deadline to finalize our budget?
We typically, we finalize the end of March, so that we were typically, or historically, had been presenting the very first meeting in April. But obviously this year, it was the next evening. But we'd always shot for our business meeting of March to approve our budgets.
Can you identify?
But then you have to adjust it based on if it's the governor's or
Then
house of
we
Representatives.
finalize our budget in June.
That's fine.
We did that on the
Okay.
27th, Monday night.
Practically,
Jason, 1 second. Okay. Can
So-
you identify who's speaking, please?
yeah, that's Mr. Rick Miller.
Our Director of Finance, and I'm sorry to do this, before we keep asking or having the same person ask questions, I did note a hand here, Dr. Pierce Gonzalez. I wanted to make sure that either your question was answered or you don't need to ask a question.
No, it wasn't answered.
Okay, it was not?
And maybe it's a point of order, I'm not sure, we don't do these joint meetings.
Wait.
1 second, okay, so it was not, so I'll come back to you after we finish. I just wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to ask a question as well. Okay.
Councilor Beach?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
It's okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So we're clear, so I know your last question was what that deadline was?
Yeah,
So you got-
yeah.
Perfect. Okay, Dr. Pierce Gonzalez.
Okay, so I got a couple of thoughts swimming around in my head. The first is, we're allowed to go back and forth, right? Like a couple of counselors spoke, and so I was like, oh, well, maybe it's not time for the school board to speak yet.
No.
That's what I did.
Okay,
No,
okay, I just want to clarify that for myself.
Yeah, we're good.
Well, basically, if you have a question, just sort of raise your hand and we'll identify you.
Okay. My comment, I guess, is I appreciate the work that was put into this. I'm hearing that the 2 budget schedules seem to line up pretty nicely. So I'm not sure, like, are we correcting, is this supposed to correct something that was done incorrectly? How is this, what's the point of this if we're already doing what we're proposing that we do?
I don't think, and please jump in, I don't
Yes.
think it's in terms of correcting anything that was done incorrectly. I think it's just really making sure that we're all on the same sheet of music and that we can do this consistently. Obviously, with some, you're always gonna have some outliers or things that's gonna change from year to year. But just looking back, not to kind of go back all the way to the past, but just, last year or our just recent budget was a little bit chaotic. And so we just want to make sure going forward that we know how we're communicating as 2 bodies together and making sure that we all have the same information and that it's almost kind of like streamlined.
Gotcha.
So it's not necessarily that we did anything incorrect or they did anything correct. We just want to come together and making sure that we're working through this process together so that it can be more collaborative and everyone's on the same sheet of music.
Okay, and Mr. Sullivan mentioned the fact that this would have to be massaged every year.
Right. And this is,
If I'm
remember,
quoting you correctly, massage is the verb you use, I like that. So,
Just remember, this is theirs.
right.
Mr.
So,
Hoffman
but
was
am I
just-
to understand that this is gonna be massaged this year, going forward?
I can't speak for that, so
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, if I may just, and I'd like to just tag on to what the chairwoman said. So prior to this discussion, there has not been a, if you will, a formalized timeline for us meeting. The only time that we received information about the budget was normally at the presentation. So what we're trying to do is take a step back where we all get together and have discussions of what your needs and wants are. And so that we can try to figure out where each other's budgets are. So by the time we get to the presentation, then we would at least have some consensus of what your needs are, and whether or not, as Mr. Hoffman says, whether or not we have to raise taxes or we don't have to raise taxes, to just try to satisfy some of the things that you guys have. Because, like I said before, there hasn't been no discussion. Just the 2x2s, but they're general discussions when we have them, but they aren't as budget related, because I know my colleagues, they have expressed the need to have constructive conversations with the school board.
Do you mind if I add some
Yeah,
comments to
yeah.
that? And that's kind of why I started with my question in terms of just, how are we going to use that liaison, right? In terms of, because
Right.
that's another component that I don't think we kind of really utilized during our last budget season. So making sure that that's something that we're going to go forward, because that will also help massage that process. And as far as so just back to what you said in terms of not really having a heads up, I think that is important that, again, of course, this year we didn't get the governor's budget, but I do feel like we had the information posted in public, and there was a lot of conversation talked, between different individuals. So I think what the mayor's saying is we want to make sure it's consistent, where there's no confusion. We don't have this group of people talking and not knowing what's going on over here. So just kind of making it more formalized and more structured. Mr. Bertrand.
I don't know if you guys will be able to it, but, we're putting the burden on council a little bit with the school board liaison. Could we have a city council liaison on the school board?
We do. That's who we're referring to.
No, I know that. I'm saying from the school board, should we have a liaison to the city council? So there's a line of communication there. So as a chairperson, I know you're busy, right? So that's hard for you to do 2x2s and keep things going.
And thank you for that. And we also kind of look at it right now, because we're a 7-man board. So of course we have some limitations there. But I think what's going to happen if we get back on schedule with our 2x2s, if that's something that we can do, then that will kind of alleviate some of that as well.
Okay, I just don't know.
That's a good point.
Right. Well, if I can chime in, so to speak about the 2x2s, and so we initially were meeting on a regular basis, monthly basis. We stopped the meetings when the school board became an elected school board. We had our city attorney look into whether or not we were still able to do that because of the possibilities of violating a public meeting.
Yeah.
But, and I'll let her speak to this because it may be different when you have two different elected bodies. Ms. Michelson.
FOIA is not well written in defining this inspo, in helping clarify this instance and how it defines what a meeting is that's open and has to be noticed. And it's a long string of commas and semicolons that can be read two different ways. And one reading of it is that it's only if it's more than two from each body. And another way it can be read is if it's more than 2 from any public body. And because of that, there hasn't been, at least as far as we have found, any general attorney opinion or any other clarification from the courts as to, obviously this issue hasn't been litigated, so that there's no clarification as to which interpretation, holds. And when, as an attorney, I always would err on the side of caution and hesitate, to not violate or have an inadvertent violation of FOIA if we met 2 by 2. So, my initial contact with the mayor was that, in abundance of caution, that may not be the best way to proceed without notice and without. But, there is like I said, reading it, it's not clear, and I don't think it would be necessarily a violation of FOIA. It's just that I couldn't give you 100% guarantee that the way that it's written, that's not what the General Assembly meant, without some further guidance.
So,
And we could call FOIA counsel and we could look into that, to get that guidance, to facilitate those meetings again.
Mr. Birkenau?
Sorry.
No.
No, I was just saying, if Maddie knew who she could reach out to with a question on the school board as a counterpart liaison, wouldn't that help?
I think that would be helpful.
That's really all I was saying.
And that's something that we could discuss as a board, but I totally see your point.
And the other option that we also discussed was that since council has for years have given the blessing that 2 representatives from council can speak to the school board, 2 school board members, that basically it's not a meeting for making decisions, but just updating each other on what's going on, and then just communicating that information back to both parties.
Thank you. And I wasn't aware of that, and that's on me. So that onus is on me, that in terms of that was like a standard practice in terms of, and please, I'm not sure that that's something that we were doing, and I could completely have my head in the sand. So I'm just, just to be completely transparent, I did not realize that that was a regular, standard practice that we were doing. So it was surprising to me when I realized that those conversations were being had with school board members, and I wasn't aware.
Okay. I saw 2 hands, one from Mr. Wallace and one from Mrs. Holman.
So I look back at our budgeting schedule for this current budget. By the 14th, the staff had made a presentation to the board with, what our requirements were and a summary of what the asks were. By February 22nd, we had, which was the first budget work session, we had already identified what the requirements were and bucketed those asks into tiers 1, 2, and 3. Is the Common Council looking for, and we had a dollar amount affixed to that as well. Is the Common Council looking for more of like an informal presentation of what that preliminary number is, being that it was available on February 22nd, or is February 22nd too late for your purposes of planning?
We're not looking for a presentation, we're looking for a dialogue.
Yeah.
And so by the time we get to the presentation stage, then those dialogues would have been had, so that we at least have an idea. But like in years past, when the presentation has come to council, and I have to admit that with the schedules of everybody here, not all the time do they have a chance to go on to the school board's site to look at their meetings, because even for myself, I'm constantly in meetings and getting emails just like the rest of them are. And so, so by the time the presentation comes to us, it'll be the first time for us, which is unfortunate, because we want to be able to participate in the dialogue. We want you guys to know that this is the amount of money that we have, and then you could say, well, this is what we need, and then we can work from there.
So looking at the proposed budget calendar, I would say that by early March, so the new proposal is to have a joint meeting in early February, which might kind of coincide with our initial budget meeting and with the identification of priorities as viewed by our staff. I think what was different this year was that, one, we didn't know how much money we were going to get, and two, I think there was a last
from the city or
from the state.
From the state, okay.
And I think there was a last minute push right before we approved our budget to propose the higher raise potential. And that came in at the last minute. That wasn't a plan, and I think that added, a significant amount of money to our proposal.
Right, and let me add some more context to that. And thank you for bringing that up, because you're right in the fact the superintendent had his budget out and presented to the board. It was the school board's idea to see if we could, vie for that extra 2%. So that he had already done his due diligence, but we then, and we I had an opportunity to talk to each school board member, and we felt that this is something that we wanted to do, even though he had already, ran his numbers and felt good about the budget that he was presenting to the board. We just wanted to, just to put it out there and say this is something that we want to fight for. So that also made it a little bit more turbulent, and so just kind of reflecting on how that came about.
It added about $1 million at the very end of the process.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Mr. Wallace.
Thank you. So I like the idea of us all trying to get together and trying to work this out also. But with elections and people switch seats and things going on for the future, will you be open, or will y'all be open to the idea of doing the school board, city council joint retreat together? And kind of somebody outside facilitated, so everybody get to know each other outside of just sitting down looking at the budget and get together and do something together. Is that something we can do, or something you know they're doing?
That is something that was mentioned earlier today, as a matter of fact, which I think is a great idea, and apparently several members on both bodies are thinking alike, and so that is something that we could have the city manager and the superintendent take a look at some point in time to schedule something like that. Councilman Bell.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I've got some thoughts on the 2x2s communications, but that's a second agenda item, is it not?
Yes.
Regularized communication. As it relates to the budget, I think having been on both sides of the equation here, I think the one thing I would encourage city council members to be aware of is these are parallel budgets. They do touch at that one key element of general funding. The bulk of the funding for the school division is through the state. And again, we don't have any control over that, but that is a funding to our community. If we approach the school division's budget as, well, here's what we've decided, I'm sorry the state hasn't figured it out yet, sucks to be you, but do we recognize that a shortfall of funding from the state to the school division is a deficit to the community at large, and that it is all of our responsibilities to look at that and to consider, are we here to backstop the school division, or is it a turf situation where that's their issue, this is our issue? So we just have to be, I'm not saying we did anything inappropriate, I'm just saying it's a mindset that we have to be aware of, that if the state is not finalizing the budget, and this year was a unique year with the governor's transition and a bit of a mood swing in Richmond, that I guess we could have seen where that was going to go and the impacts it was going to have on the budget cycle. But we've got to work together as a community at large and not just we're council and we have this responsibility, and you're a school board and you have this responsibility. So, I think, and none of that lays evenly over this budget calendar. So that's something we just want to be aware of more from kind of an awareness and an ethos of how we approach this in the future. I think one of the other challenges we get into with the budget, and in some cases it feels a little us against them. I'm familiar with how the state funds SOQ funding. So if they're going to provide a 3% raise, 4% rise, 5% raise for SOQ funding. So Jason, what is SOQ? That's instructional staff only?
No, that includes support staff. It includes
Okay,
instructional
but that
staff.
represents what percentage of?
Roughly a third, or a little bit higher than that, 40%.
40%?
A good example, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
A good example is the bonus, right? So you heard that all state employees are going to get a $1,000 bonus. Well, that's for SOQ funded positions. So that forced us to give a $1,000 bonus to the other 60% of our employees. So we had to redistribute, and that's what we did last night, is redistribute money from targeted cost to compete raises to make sure every employee got a $1,000 bonus. The state only funded 40% of that.
Right, and that's the challenge that, I understand the spillover effect or the cascading effect on the school board, but it seems to also cascade over onto the city council when it's like, well, if they're getting 5%, we want 5%. So a 40% coverage of the Winchester Public Schools staff cascades to a 60% remainder and 100% of the city employment. Now, the employees love it, and it's not a problem. But when it comes to figuring out our budget, it presents some real challenges. And so again, we've got to work together in pulling in the same direction than creating this us against them mentality in the approach to the budget.
And if I may, going back to Corey's comment, next year we have a little bit of tea leaves already kind of projected out. So we know right now that next year the budget will call for another 5% raise for employees. We know that today. But to your point, that 5% funding from the state will only cover 40% of our employees. So we've got to find 60% locally. And if y'all do a 5% raise, which we've always done historically, is match each other, that's 100% of your employees.
So you can see it coming.
It's a great point, yeah.
Chairwoman.
No comment about that. Anyone else have any questions or comments about some of the things that we've discussed?
Councilor Herbstreit.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess, I think the timeline is good, and this is good that we're connecting and can get on the same page. And this will shift and change some, and I agree, I think next year is going to be a little bit easier. But the one thing that stands out in my mind, and maybe Mr. Hoffman or Superintendent can answer this, I'm thinking about the HVAC system that's going to be $16 million. And where's that money going to come from? $16 million. So when we look at this timeline, I think, I don't know if that's coming up next year, if that's 3 years out, but when we start looking at the budget and the city and now potentially $16 million, that's going to be a heavy lift for you all, and what role will the city be playing in that? So I think stuff like that we need to look at far enough out in advance, hopefully, and back that into where we are now, so that we're not stuck in a year where we're having to come up with $16.8 million to cover Winchester Public Schools, because that's going to be, I don't see how the city could do that. So.
And I think that's a good question and a good point. And I will mention without any detail. Of course, Mr. Miller, Dr. Van Huffman, you can sure add some context to it. I totally think that we have been able to kind of use the funds that we do have creatively, and especially when we have grants and things that are not necessarily earmarked for something specific, because we have that number that you just said. We're aware of those things that are coming down the pipeline, so when we look at our budget and we look at our capital funds and all those things, we kind of know where we have some wiggle room to move money around so that we don't have to keep coming to city council for this and that and the other. So maybe, Dr. Van Huffman, if you want to give some more
Yeah, I'd love to give some context to that. So what you're referring to is capital expenses. And so really you're describing what I would call major capital infrastructure, like renovating John Kerr Elementary School, like renovating the Douglas School on Kent Street. Those big ticket items, and for us, when it gets over $500,000, we start thinking of it as a big ticket item. Now we have in the past been able to fund some capital improvements that range from $500,000 to $1 million. For example, the turf field at Hanley Bowl. But once it crosses that $1 million mark, that's what our capital improvement plan is for, that we submit to the city every December. So that's approved every December. That timeline starts in October and goes to December. It projects the first 5 years pretty tight, and then it projects 5 to 10 years out. And so, Mary Blow and Dan have access to that, and so they can see the horizon, because it's obvious that a $16 million HVAC repair is going to require bonding, right? We're not going to fund that from local dollars. That does lead to what we have been able to do, which Marie is referring to, which is our MOU, which is the ability that we have historically to take operating expenses at the end of every year and use that for capital purchases. And that's why we don't come to city council on an annual basis for a turf field, a new track, tennis courts, roof repairs, HVAC, minor HVAC systems, etc. And that's been a very good process, because most divisions would come every year in addition to the operating budget. They would come with their list of capital repairs that they would have to ask for. So it's a good point that that needs to be clarified. But the $16 million is certainly, that's not something we're going to be able to fund through operating expenses. It's not something you'll probably be able to fund through any savings, and that's why we put that capital improvement plan out every December.
Thank you.
Ms. Trubin?
I have two comments I want to make. One is just, we're talking about raises and salary increases and what we've done historically. I think collectively we need to be willing to challenge ourselves a little bit in both bodies, that the labor market has changed. It has evolved over what we've done over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And how do we look at labor a little bit differently? What is the cost of labor, and how do we meet that cost and demand so that both bodies can get the right individuals, the right level of talent and skill sets into the right roles? And that may mean we have to think about how we do raises differently. And that may mean that we don't always mirror what we do in the schools in the city, depending on what the cost of labor is for those particular roles at that particular time. And I mean that even internally to the school system, to say, do we have to challenge ourselves that maybe there is a year where our staff, which we've done in the past, where our teachers had a higher raise because of that cost to compete. If you remember all that work that's been done over the past 5 to 7 years, I'm starting to lose track now, I apologize. But we went after that as a division and said, okay, this is what we can do for everybody, but we're not competitive anymore for our instructional positions, so we're gonna do more. And that is hard. Those are very hard conversations to have with the employees who are not in that do more bucket, because you value them just as much, but you have to look at what the market is requiring to bring talent to bear. And I just think that's something we need to continue to do, not only within our own bodies, but between the bodies. On the timeline, I would just love to see the two groups come together, and it could be asynchronously, of course, meeting all the open meeting requirements. Like, what does that meeting look like? What would be our objectives of the meeting in early February? What do we all want to walk away from with? Do we want to have a shared understanding of each other's pain points and budgets, of each other's strategic visions? I mean, there's a million different directions we could go there. But I think that if we spend time, or maybe the two leaders of the governing body spend time talking about, when we all walk out of that meeting in early February, what do we want to come away with, and then design backwards from there, so that it truly is a dialogue. Dr. Van Hukelum, I can't speak for Mr. Hoffman, but Dr. Van Hukelum is extremely gifted in challenging us as a board and designing very interactive activities that help us think through the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve. And of course, we have hundreds of educators that do the same really well. So are there activities we could do like that that truly foster us not talking at one another, but talking with one another to end up in a really great place, you know, after that meeting, and feeling good about, hey, we're going to reconnect in 45 or 60 days, and here's what we need to know, and information we need to get you all as you are working through your own budget processes.
You're absolutely correct, and I do think, like myself and the chairwoman, we meet on a regular basis, so we can start formalizing those discussions, as Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Van Hukelum can do the same. And Mr. Hoffman and myself meet weekly, and then we can just start planning for that. And having this discussion and meeting now, prior to when the timeline begins, that helps us quite a bit, so we can work towards that. Councilman Beach?
Thank you. Back up what Erica said, and I agree with you 100%. The earlier we start our joint discussions, the better, in my opinion. And in the past, we've had the 2x2s, and I think they are great. I hope that we keep them regular. And maybe even asking both bodies, hey, do you have any questions that I can take to the other side, and then give us feedback would be helpful. And the liaison position is fantastic communication. She can go to meetings, communicate to the school board, or communicate back to us. That's fantastic. Elias mentioned retreats. I don't recall that we really had a retreat, so to speak, but we used to have a lot of socials, not really geared to doing business, but getting to know each other. We advertised an open meeting, but we really didn't focus on business. You know, I got to know Doctor here and what his hobbies are and interests, and you know, things like that. It helped us work better as a body. So maybe we can do one of those, whether it's a social retreat, whatever you call it. I don't care, but I think that would help both bodies get to know each other better and work better.
I mean, I'm definitely open to that. Of course, I'm not the deciding factor, but I do think that there are a lot of benefits to doing something like that, where we do get to know each other on a different level, and you know, where we can kind of loosen up a little bit. I think that's important. What that looks like, I don't know, but I definitely take your point to that.
Are there any other questions on this item?
A comment,
Mr.
comment
Gonzalez.
permissible. I wanted to piggyback off of, excuse me, what Richard said earlier about, he said a lot, and it was really good context for how these budgets go. And I'm just concerned that we're trying to preemptively solve, I don't want to say problems, but we're trying to preemptively correct any kind of incorrections that may come down the line. This year we did add at the very last minute a budget request. And I fear that the more that we try to preemptively solve these problems, again, I'm not phrasing that correctly, but I don't want to lose that flexibility going forward to say, hey, you know what? We got to present this tomorrow, and I've been thinking about it, and I really think we got to do this. Does anybody else have a thought about that as well? So again, it's just a comment. I don't want to lose that flexibility. I appreciate what we're trying to do here, but you know, kind of the heart of the matter is sometimes this stuff is like you're juggling balls up in the air, and sometimes one ball goes that way, you know.
Right, and just to address your concern, I think the point here is we want to have a plan in place, and it doesn't mean that the plan is rock solid, but it means that we have a roadmap in terms of this is where we are, and this is where we need to get to, and these are the kind of, you know, the points that we need to kind of hit, the markers that we need to hit so that we can achieve this outcome. And of course, that comes with flexibility. We have to be flexible. But I think really it's about us having, managing expectations, knowing what to expect, and then being able to kind of move forward with almost like those guardrails, right? We know that this is our plan, and we have a roadmap to get to it with some flexibility built in, so.
Just a comment.
Council.
Just a comment, just piggybacking on that. I feel that if you have that better communication and that better relationship, when you come up with that last minute plan, somebody on the other side may probably be thinking that same thing or was already kind of like on that same wavelength with you. So it's not so much as a surprise because you've already been having these conversations and building those relationships amongst both bodies. And so I just feel like that would really, it wouldn't be as a surprise, I think, or it wouldn't be as a shocker to everyone. It would just kind of be something that could easily be talked about, like with Ms. Trubin mentioning, you know, about the being able to be flexible with increases and maybe looking at that type of conversation, that type of being able with both bodies to look at, well, maybe we can do this adjustment, well, maybe we can do this adjustment over here, but it's really just having that open communication and being able to build on those relationships.
If I may, talking about the flexibility part of it, so with the timeline that we have, and it's really important, especially with the staff and the city manager, where there's a point within this timeline that you can only be so flexible. It can't be a last minute thing like the night before, because just like you all, we have a timeline that we have to present, and once we're presented with one or two options, they go back and make the adjustments, then we can't come to the next meeting and say, oh, by the way. So I'm not saying that we aren't flexible, but there's only so much flexibility that you can have when you are getting to the last point. And I'm looking at here where in mid-May, where the budget ad is published. And by that, we have the first reading and a second reading of the budget. So I know even this year, Mr. Hoffman had said, well, this is the budget, and I can't go back and forth and do this and that, so we have to vote on either this or that, and where we couldn't make any more changes to it. So
if I could respond, then perhaps our budget schedules mirror each other too closely. Maybe they should be staggered a little bit. What's the point of having a deadline if it's not really the deadline? The deadline was a month ago. You see what I'm saying? If maybe we need to get our budget in a little bit, or done presentable a little bit sooner, so that that does not leave you guys in the 12th hour trying to figure out a new addition that we make.
Yeah, and ours isn't identical to this, so that's something that Jason was talking about earlier. That's not new. We've been doing that. We always do our budget ahead and present to them. But I think what he's talking about in terms of, and this is not new, and I don't think your previous comments was when you were talking about flexibility. There's order, there's structure, right? We have deadlines, we have timelines that we have to meet, so that's not new, right? So I just want to make sure that your concern is addressed in terms of the budget season is not a new concept. We're just trying to create a little bit more structure and collaboration between the two bodies so that we can get to the desired outcome kind of more cohesively, right? Where the left hand knows what the right hand is doing appropriately and then going forward. But I wouldn't worry about it's too rigid, we can't kind of make any adjustments. But of course, there are some things that we're not going to be able to move because there are some timelines and dates that we can't move. But I think the whole idea is as Ms. Rodriguez says, as we're collaborating, some of those things will come up so that it's not last minute. These meetings will give us a platform where we can talk about those things as two bodies so that it's not last minute. So,
Thank you.
I want to say that I've always felt that the common council and the school board have had a good collaborative working relationship. I think this year there were a lot of things that were just out of whack. We had a House budget, Senate budget, and a proposed governor's budget, which were vastly different. We had a new governor come in, and then the numbers changed, and it took a long time before we knew what our numbers were. In one scenario, I don't think we would have been asking for much. In another scenario, we were asking for a lot. And I think, you know, the timing of the information that we received, and we got preliminary numbers in March, but we didn't get final numbers until much, much later. And again, I think the last minute, you know, let's push for the 2% threw things out of whack as well. But I would hope, and it's been my perspective, that we have worked really well. I think it's a great idea to try to give some more uniformity to the process and the information sharing so that there are no surprises out of left field, and everyone feels that everyone is being transparent to, you know, because the school division is an agency of the city. And I would like to think that the Common Council supports the schools, because if we don't have quality schools in our community, we're not going to be able to attract the residents, the businesses, and to this community that will enable us to generate revenues for the city to fund our projects. So.
Councilman Sullivan.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of touch on Garrett's point, which is, you know, what we do in this potential meeting. I would like to know the top 10 priorities of the school board. You know, what are the top big ticket items? Because we have to think, you know, in terms of, you know, big numbers. I could probably sit here and guess 4, maybe 5, but I don't think I could come up with 10. You know, when to be in this position as you are in yours, it tends to be information overload all day, every day, emails, text, phone calls, I mean, you name it, and things just fall off the radar. And so if we get together and have this type of, you know, meeting, I would like to get what those are, kind of the context behind them, and just get a little better understanding of some of the challenges that you guys face, the hows and the whys and things like that. Because to me, when the budget rolls around, it's just a number. It really tends to just be a number, and figure out a way to fund it or not fund it. And I think that's a little, I think we're not doing the taxpayers much justice by doing that. I think we need a little bit deeper dive on some things. So maybe that's one thing that you guys could present. One thing we could present is other things that we're doing that might not be necessarily budget related, but we're trying to help the schools. You know, we had some recent projects that we approved that, you know, the developers were gonna give housing credits to teachers and city employees and things like that. So, you know, just things to where we can get a better understanding and a little bit better aligned about why you do what you do and kind of why we do what we do and how we do it. That would be one thing I'd like to see.
Mr. Sullivan, can I ask you just a clarifying question? Are you talking about just for the budget season in terms of you're talking about those 10 big ticket items?
You know, starting out, whatever you guys would think. I mean, I think it would help if they were, you know, focused on the budget, like $16 million HVAC systems. Okay, well, what's coming after that? You know, do you have an idea of, well, this is, you know, 3-4 years from now, get ready because this other shoe's going to drop.
Right.
Just things of that nature.
Right, and I think we've been thinking like that. We just didn't have the right, I guess, mechanisms in place, and that's how we were looking at the liaison.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, I've been on here 8 years, and this is the first time we've done this.
I understand.
Yeah.
I'm just saying for the board, we were looking at that liaison being that person that's really in those meetings and then conveying what they pull from the meeting to council. But I understand that we wanted to be a little different in terms of where more of us are meeting more often and talking about these items. So I just wanted to clarify the point, because I think what you just said is something that we thought about and really put that kind of mechanism in place to do that, but it hasn't been effective.
Well, and I'll give it over to Elias. I mean, the emails are great, the Facebook posts are great, you know, the tweets are great, but nothing beats being nothing beats this, you know, the one-on-one kind of thing that that type of meeting would bring. I think just the interpersonal kind of things that we could get out of just sitting around and just having a conversation. So.
I think Ms. Holman had her hand up.
Okay, can I do want to say too, just being cognizant of time, I just want to give everyone an opportunity to add to it. We don't want to keep going back and forth unless you have a question, just, need something clarified. We just want to just be aware of the time, and then I know we have one more item on here, so.
Mr. Solomon, my question is to you. Are you looking for something beyond the identification of our priorities that we communicate out in February? Are you looking for more of a formal, get together to discuss those priorities?
I think it's open to figuring that out. I mean, this is okay. I think something maybe a little more casual than this might be better, but that's up to the group. I know there's the public meeting notifications and things like that we have to be mindful of, but somebody that's more experienced in sitting a group of 16 or 18 people down and getting the most out of them, I'm fine with having them come up with some ideas, but the content-wise, we can figure it out. I mean, maybe we get to another, Les, give me what you want to know. I'll tell you what I want to know. Phil can tell you what he wants to know. Evan can tell you that, and then we'll come up with a hit list, and you guys do the same. And, eventually we'll come up with something that's manageable and can start. We need to start or restart, really, I think, kind of some precedents and some tradition, which we've gotten away from. COVID, all of it just really closed the door on a lot of that. I mean, we all kind of drifted our separate ways, and I think we kind of need to steer the ship right.
So, thank you. We'll take one more question on this item or one more comment on this item, and then we'll move to the next. Mr. Wallace.
Mine's not a question, mine's just a comment. And I'm glad we're talking about scheduling and stuff, and I just want everybody to understand that a lot of the thinking decisions that I make come from the people that work for us and the people right. And we have to understand that we're affected. The taxes get raised, things get raised in the city that y'all have to do. That does affect our workers and causes us to make decisions real quick. So I just don't want this all to be about us talking about schedule. It's great, but I want the citizens to know that we're also thinking about them too in the same process and trying to build something better so we can be more clear what's going on and what the real day-to-day things that our workers are feeling that live here, or what's going on y'all's end, what y'all see in y'all workers and what y'all deal with. So I just want to make sure that people understand that it's not just us sitting here talking about making a better schedule. I want this to be understood, we're trying to make a better city. So that's all.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next item, which is the regularly scheduled communication. And it seems like we touched upon it a little bit throughout. I just want to put that out there since it is on the agenda. If there's any further conversation on this. Councilman Bell.
Yes. I kind of leaned into the 2x2s before because I think they were very productive resource back when I was on the school board. I never participated in them, but I always felt like that you were getting a sufficient cross-section of each body and leadership to have that level of communication, probably more at a strategic level. I think the liaison component is good, but I think that's more of general information flow. Here's what happened, here's what I'm seeing, because you can have dialogue at the liaison level, dialogue at the chair and the president level, dialogue at the superintendent and city manager level, but if you all played the telephone game, many times that doesn't always mean that everybody is fully aligned. If you can get those 2x2s and very organized and create relationship, I think you can have a much more aligned and to get everybody pulling in the same direction. I think that's important. So I think whatever we have to do to get them back in place, whether it's understanding the legal risks or the FOIA risks we might be taking, and the things we can do to mitigate it, I think we should go in that direction. I think the conversation about having informal gatherings to foster a relationship is, if you've got the 2x2s, and I'm not saying these meetings aren't productive, but if you've got the 2x2s and informal gatherings, they can be probably just as productive or more productive than the 2x2s and another formal meeting that we would have as a body. just throwing that out there as a possibility. I'm open to anything that helps build relationship, but I think the 2x2s are almost an absolute necessity.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Mr. Birkenau?
I totally agree with Richard. And I also suggest maybe that the 2x2s are rotating. It's not the same 4 people, that, you know, that there's some different representation from each body at those 2x2 meetings. Just an idea. We don't all hear things the same way.
Councilman Milstead?
I think that's an excellent idea. I'd also like to throw out that one of the things I think that we need defined within the communication is, pardon me, what is it that the council would like to hear, needs to hear from the board, and what is it that the board needs to hear from the council? That really helps to define what it is we're going to talk about, how we can address issues and such.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions?
Good to see y'all.
So I want to thank everyone for attending this meeting tonight, and much appreciated. I think there's been a lot of clarification and good conversation. And so, not to belabor that, I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Well, sorry, let me back up. I have to do it with council, and she has to.
Right.
Yeah.
Second.
I mean, in such a hurry.
Ready to go home.
Second.
Councilman Bell made the motion to adjourn, and we have a second from Councilman Beach. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are now adjourned.
So I think I had a motion by Ms. Holman to adjourn. Do we have a second? Second by Dr. Pierce Gonzalez. I know everyone's in favor. Dr. Joyner, you got that? Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
I do too, but not.